start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Problem is not the report of the patients, but the interpretation of those reports by doctors. We think that it's oftentimes discriminatory, and also we think that we can prevent opioid crisis on our side of the house more. That's why I'm proud to propose. So 2 ways to win this debate. First, we explain how we will have more fairer and non-discriminatory, like the appropriate prescription on our side of the house. And secondly, why we can prevent opioid crisis or such kind of things. But before we move on to those points, a couple things to set up. What basic, academic studies look like. First thing is that we assume feasibility, which means that we assume the existence of available studies for many conditions, causes, or like the causes, like what kind of a surgery needs what kind of a prescription, for example. But B, mean that individuals' painkiller studies is also like existing on our side of the house. For example, efficacy or what kind of amount is appropriate in order for certain conditions. But second here is that we think that this motion basically talks about like the starting dose or basic dose, right? We will start at this amount for this, like the person who has this amount of this weight, for example. We think that doctors will first prescribe this like the painkillers based on the academic studies, and they are required to check it after 1 week or 2 weeks. I think it's a general like understanding, and we think that if it's not working, of course like the doctors will change their ways. We think that, but still like that's like period it's very short, maximum 1 or 2 weeks we believe. But thirdly, we think that best quality or high quality guidelines is likely to exist on our side of the house because doctors are required to follow these guidelines, which means that they are taught in medical school, which means that doctors have more understanding of such guidelines. Secondly, it's distributed to doctors working in the field, which means that they also have such access. But three, we think that patients can also access to such information because of the fact that like the doctors are likely to say that you can look at these guidelines, and I think that government also has the incentive to create easier guidelines in order to spread such information to them, which means that the doctors are far more accountable in the current situation because like the patients can check whether they have the amount of dose that they the guideline says. We think that if the doctors are not following maybe like the warning for the first time, but maybe in the future it's like it would be suspension of license, for example, or more like the punishment. So first argument, how doctors treat in the current situation. I think the first thing to point out here is to take in the best case of opposition. Like what doctors prescribe may be generally correlated with the academic studies because doctors trust patients and patients report certain amounts like accurately, like the reports their feeling of pain for people. Patients are understanding pain pretty good because like what kind of a they can judge based on what kind of behaviors they can do or they cannot do, or they oftentimes experience like the pain in a daily life. But secondly, the problem is not the report coming from the patients, but the interpretation of patients' comments, we believe. For example, like academic researchers must give patients pain score directly, like without any changing such scores. But there's a second-hand bias. When you see, for example, a woman who are scoring 8 out of 10, for example, like that they directly report, but doctors will say that the many women are hysteric, for example, or many women are vulnerable, and that's why maybe like the true pain level is less than 8 or 6 or 7. For example, a black person report 8 in the 1 to 10 report. Doctors have bias of 8, like they cannot imagine the vulnerability of those like the racial minority people, or B, they doubt that they might engage in other like opioid trades, for example, or the painkiller like the trades. I mean that's why in the current situation there are so many cases that those minority people are underprescribed. Other than like other people are like in a different situation, which means that it's particularly hard for minority people to communicate with the doctors accurately in order to tell their conditions in the very detail, for the fact that they have like different languages, for example mother tongue, or they have less capacity, like the doctors have less capacity to understand the conditions or situation on their side of the house. We think that on our side, counterfactual, there's objective criteria of prescription exist, which means that doctors are more likely doctors will have to follow these conditions, and that's why we are so good. We think that those the studies are likely to be liberal, and we can say that we also assume the feasibility, and we think that those the prescription based on academic studies is far more better. Why accurate prescription is particularly important for minority people? Because chronic pain or prevents people do what they need, right? For example, in terms of women, they are oftentimes having the the job of carrying responsibility, for example, children or elderly people, meaning that it's very psychologically punishing when those people cannot take that role, and you feel that you cannot care people who you want to help, meaning that it leads to the chronic stress, which actually accelerates the level of pain. And also, they also feel reluctant to go to hospital when they feel that they are under-prescribed in the current situation. When they have meaningless discussion or outcome when they go to school, when they go to hospitals, they're less likely to go to such place. On a counterfactual, this motion gives confidence to the diagnosis, which means that the patients are more likely to go to hospitals early, which mitigates the level of stress that they might get from the pain. But B, the early treatment, which means that they're more likely to take healthy activities like exercises, other things that basically improves their mental health and also the physical health as well. We prove that, which means that the increasing health in vulnerable individuals and also increasing access to health system exist on our side of the house. So second way, opioid crisis, why it's so why we prevent it. In that first, professionals are not using opioid for long-term treatment. Maybe there are alternatives exist like medical marijuana, which are less addictive than opioid, for example. Which means that when they do prescribe opioids, they are likely to prescribe small amounts, like 100 pills, which basically creates the monitoring system works. But secondly, I think that in developing countries like Canada, for example, there's almost no opioid crisis to the same extent of the US. I mean that's why if we have a proper system, US can also do the same thing and prevent opioid crisis. The status quo, what happens here is that the overprescribing opioid than the usual for the other types of people, right? For example, when men are reporting 9 or 10 out of 10, doctors think that the men don't report such pain usually, and that's why there tends to prescribe more painkillers. And I think that it's empirically true that how those men were historically treated as very strong, and that's why there are the tendency where men are overprescribed by opioids. Counterfactual here is that because of the guideline and also these academic studies exist, they are required to follow, and they are unlikely to make them overdose, which is why we can prevent. Why this impact needs to our side? Because increasing demand from doctors about research. There are increasing demand for research, which means that there's more budget and there's more education about this field. And also we think that doctors will look at those studies more. That's why we think the accessibility to academic studies is also unique to our side. I'm very proud of those.
Thank you, Tetsushi, for that speech. And now I'd like to welcome the first negative speaker, Harry, to begin the case for Queensland 1. Here.
Friends, ANU cannot have their cake and eat it too in this debate. They cannot both tell you that these studies are likely to be perfect, because that's just the purpose of the debate, and try and give you a ton of reasons as to why it's likely that doctors are going to prescribe very badly based on reported medical pain levels. I'm going to bring you arguments in this speech as to why it is likely in this debate that when we assume that they are going to act on those metrics, they're going to do it worse under their side through analysis rather than assertion. I'm going to do a few things in this speech. Firstly, some points of setup about feasibility, about why doctors are likely to prescribe badly. Secondly, tell you about why pain medication ought not be subjective, and thirdly, I'm going to bring you a second point of substantive about other stuff. Okay, firstly, setup. What do we think that feasibility means in this debate? We believe that feasibility means your ability to base prescriptions on academia. It does not mean that you have the ability to just assume that the academia is always and universally correct. If you do have the fiat to believe that academia is always and universally correct, we also have the fiat to assume that doctors are always and universally correct at prescribing based on what people report, and they're not going to just misjudge that. I think that additionally, we observe that even if doctors are not going to treat patients as the way that they would desire under our side, patients are able to argue for things. They are also able to access alternative doctors. I think that now let's look at why doctors are likely to prescribe very badly, and I think this is going to be quite responsive to a few things that they do not necessarily prove in their speech about why prescriptions are likely to be bad under their side. Firstly, just diagnoses are likely to be wrong for things such as demographic reasons. That's just due to the fact that doctors are likely to traditionally come from more privileged backgrounds. They're unlikely to have comparative empathy to the average person on the street. But very importantly, if they say the same is true under doctors at the moment, I think we can weigh this. That's to say that academia, which has existed in the past and is based on the past, comes from a time when the social progress has not come as far. I think we can say that doctors currently have developed somewhat, but they had not at the point that research had, which is to say that the research is regressive compared to the status quo of doctors giving diagnoses. Now, that's why they're more likely to be more progressive and more empathetic under our side. Secondly, doctors are likely to just tend to overgeneralize under their side. That's because they're likely to be overexposed. Certain things are likely to reject the patient's ideas under their side. Additionally, they want to say that they're going to have a starting dose that they're going to look at, and then they're going to change based on something afterwards. I think this is borderline a squirrel in this debate, because it's saying that you're not doing it based on the academia after the first week. But additionally, I don't know how they're going to determine what you diagnose and what you prescribe after the first week, other than if they just decide actually we should listen to what the patient says, or if they're going to say there's magically a whole bunch of extra research based on a few new factors that I don't know how much they're going. I think that idea needs far more illustration than it got at first. Additionally, I think that the academia itself is likely to be wrong for a couple of reasons. Again, firstly, it's likely to be historically racist and sexist in the data collection. I think that often this is cyclical because research is often based on prior research. So if you research based on a prior piece of research, you're likely to have that based on flaws that you observed earlier. Thirdly, I think that pain is still largely something that is not fully understood to a significant extent. I think that pain is something that's very subjective and personal, that I think means that, for example, you cannot see pain in an X-ray. It's something that is both very esoteric within someone's mind, but also your experience of it is quite subjective. I think fourthly, academia is likely to need to overgeneralize for the fact that you need to get collect data points, you need to create broad trends and broad statistics. It cannot be very personal to the individual patient. Why then do we think pain medication ought to be subjective? Firstly, just because pain is subjective, it varies by person to person. It's the biological processes of things such as nerve signals and brain chemistries. Observe, secondly, that pain is also experienced. It's not just something that is present. That's to say that even if you do have an objective way of identifying how much your nerve firing in your mind, that does not necessarily equate to the same amount of pain a person is feeling from patient to patient. That means that you're likely to that means that you're not likely to be able to actively prescribe based on how much pain someone is actually feeling, and pain is likely to be incredibly subjective. Observe that this occurs even if patients are experiencing the same condition. You're still likely to have significant variation in the pain that they're likely to perceive. Why do we think applying literature is therefore going to, at that point, the conclusion is that applying literature is going to give diagnoses that are not catered to the individual pain that the individual is suffering. What do we think this looks like? It looks like in some cases, patients are not suffering as much as the literature necessarily says, and you're likely to prescribe too much. I think this is very problematic because that increases the risk of things such as side effects. Secondly, it means that you may just prescribe too little, and I think that that's particularly bad because that means patients are still in pain, which is a massive thing that they are suffering in this debate. I think that's very important. That is an immediate harm that they face immediately. The third thing is that they are not diagnosed in the first place, which I think is especially bad because A, they are not receiving any medication. They are still going to be in pain, but they do not receive even at very best a placebo effect of some form of medication at that point. Why is this important? Because pain is subjective, we ought to cater it to the individual. Medicine should be about helping an individual person improve their standard of living, and to the extent that you are not helping it on an individual level, we believe that it is failing in its purpose. That is to say that even if they're able to prove that you are practically somehow better off, what they want as a patient is still something that is important and still should be considered quite important. Okay, second point is substantive, why this is particularly bad for patients who have chronic health conditions. I think the important thing to observe here about chronic health conditions is that even compared to other forms of pain, they are still things that are uniquely difficult for medicine to understand in its current form. That's to say that it is very difficult to know where these things come from, but additionally, it's very, very difficult to empathize about those certain kind of conditions. It's incredibly difficult to understand what it must be like to have a medical condition that will never get better and to be literally feeling sick for the rest of your life if you are not currently experiencing it. It's something that doctors are likely to be very bad, it's likely that literature is going to be quite bad at understanding it because it's so difficult to understand, and that doctors are unlikely to be particularly good at empathizing with it. Why do we think that those people are likely to be particularly bad off? That means that they're likely that people who have chronic health conditions are particularly bad off in this debate. Why do we think this is particularly bad? Firstly, because they're just quite vulnerable, they're likely to suffer for the longest. Secondly, I think you end up with things such as them not getting diagnoses in the first place because you do not understand the cause of a condition, and that is a very big harm because that means they do not receive any medication whatsoever. What do we believe the harms of that are? That leads to the harm that people are less likely to do things such as report in the first place, observe the harms of that have already been mechanized for you and impacted by first affirmative for us. They're likely to mean that people are less likely to come forward, and I think that means that, and that's particularly bad, because that means that even if someone is then suffering less, feeling pain less than they actually are and desperately needs a lot of help, they're unlikely to come forward, which means they do not get the benefit of that under their side of the house. Additionally, I think you worsen medical studies under their side of the house, because in order to get people to show up to your study, in order to get more research about something such as a chronic health condition, you need people to show up. And that's incredibly unlikely to happen if A, they are not receiving any medication, so they are stuck in bed and unable to get out of it, or secondly, even if they are able to at least get out of bed, they do not want to show up to the hospital for the trial because they do not trust the medical system. That means you get worse literature under their side, which is especially bad given how we've already proven how it started off incredibly bad. At the end of this speech, the thing that's important to recognize is that it is not possible to magically have a study that understands everyone perfectly, because everyone understands their pain in a very personal and individual manner. That's why people needed medication that was also in the same form of a very personal and subjective manner that was able to cater to their needs, because that was how you were able to get people to actually have their needs met, to stop feeling pain, to get a diagnosis in the first place. That was how you got all of the flow and benefits in this debate. So proud to oppose.
I thank Harry for that speech, and to continue the case for ANU 1, Gypsy.
When I was 11, I went to the doctor with what me, my mum, and the doctor all agreed was a sinus infection behind my eye. And all the doctor told me was to take some Nurofen and hope that it gets better. I took a lot of Nurofen, ended up in the ER because I overdosed on Nurofen because it was incredibly painful, and it was the only way to not be sensitive to light and to screens, to be able to do things like read and enjoy my day. And I also did not underlie the resolving issue, which needed antibiotics, which got to the point that it nearly threatened my sight in one eye, nearly threatened, like my brain and whether or not I could see. This is the experience of hundreds, if not thousands of people in the medical system whose pain is dismissed by doctors who do not understand them, as this team gives them mechanisms for why they don't, compared to research that is unable to discount that cannot tell an 11-year-old girl that their experience is not valid because they are timid, because they do not want to ask for antibiotics that are going to be given. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, some characterization pushback. Secondly, on bias and prescription. And finally, on this principle about subjective pain. On characterization pushback, they say feasibility cannot always be correct. We do not claim this. We're just just say feasibility means we have to require that there is a base of literature that you could have this on. So the literature just must exist for it to be feasible. Doesn't necessarily have to be good. I'll talk about why it's likely to be good a bit later in my speech. But additionally, we don't ever claim that it is, the best or perfect, just that it is significantly better than doctors that they have to stand by under their side of the house. Obviously, they've got to be comparative on that. The second thing they say is that we squirrel because we talk about a starting dose. Again, read the motion. It is about basing this upon a particular metric. I would argue that we are definitely allowed some sort of discretion for the factors that they agree that there is intersectionality of different diseases and stuff like that. It's unlikely that we could just feasibly have a algorithmic mechanism of outputting exactly how much pain prescriptions people could have. Obviously, we just minimize the harms of biases into our case. Additionally, they say, how does this look? What does this look like? I think this looks like you being given an initial dose. It may be being inappropriate because you're experiencing more pain or less pain than potentially the average. And then coming back to your doctor and going, I still can't go to my job. I still can't look after my children. Or I'm just the side effects of this drug are really, really bad. I'm overdosing on it. A couple of weeks later, and then being able to reduce that or decrease it or not. The difference is that in that instance, the doctor has to give you an appropriate amount of drug, a similar amount of drug in the first place, and then they have to listen to your experience with how you interpret it, and then are able to adjust in that situation. I definitely do not think that is squirreling. Again, we would suggest that in most instances this baseline is probably correct. I'll talk about universality later, but that it, there probably is room for some level of discretion, just because I think it is probably necessary. On bias. Okay, firstly on why doctors are bad, secondly why academia is good, and then finally their stuff on chronic health. On interpretation, on doctors being bad, I think we give you, and they agree with a bunch of reasons why doctors are bad. That is because they are privileged, they went to medical school, often particularly really specialized doctors are very male, generally. They often view other people who are not like them as hysterical or as threatening. We give you this at first. They buy into particular stereotypes. They view people as hypochondriacs and discredit their pain. They do things like discredit specific issues. Endometriosis is massively, massively underprescribed things for, because a lot of doctors just do not understand the pain of this. Academia tells us how painful this is. Academia has recognized that this underprescription happens, and claims it. But doctors are able to say, oh, maybe it's not endo, maybe it's something else. Maybe try going on the pill and that will resolve it, which obviously doesn't in majority of cases. We tell you additionally, and they agree, doctors deal with so many cases that they are undersensitized. They're likely to devalue pain because it is less bad than the pain that they saw that morning, or the pain that they saw, in someone who went in that. They're likely to marginalize and not take it seriously, and that is compounded by the fact that minority groups are likely to have communication issues with their doctors. They're likely to be intimidated because they do not feel related to in the doctor who got a perfect ATAR and was able to go to medical school and then specialize and become, a specialist pain doctor, because they do feel threatened by that because they've had bad experiences in the past, because they don't want to ask for more than they feel like they are given. Because when the doctor challenges them on their pain, which they are more likely to do if they view them as less legitimate, they're likely to back down and go, oh, I'm not really sure, I couldn't really tell you what the comparison is. That means the doctors are pretty awful. Let's compare that to academia and why it's good. Basically, the only thing they tell us here is that academia is historical, and that means that there is likely to be historic bias implemented into it. I think that at first we tell you that academia a lot of the time is just unable to have this bias because it is more quantitative or more qualitative in ways that kind of work this out. What this looks like is you get a group of people who, for example, have some sort of chronic health condition, who've also experienced things like having their wisdom teeth removed or having an arm broken, and you get them to draw comparisons between those things. You get them to rate it on a numerical scale and stuff like that. Obviously, it is just very, very hard to have bias in those instances compared to when a doctor asks you, rate it on a scale of 10, and you go, oh, I think it's probably about an 8, and they're like, are you sure? And then they're like, oh, maybe it's a 7, and forces you to back down in that instance. Obviously, when you're in an academic situation or a trial, you probably don't have someone interrogating you to that level. You're probably in a room, you're doing it by yourself with paper. There isn't that kind of pressure. It is more anonymous. Your name isn't attached to it. You probably don't have a past relationship with this doctor, which means that you maybe feel awkward about it or something else. Additionally, you aren't paying $150 to try and get something out of it. You don't view them as much as a figure of authority that you should look up to. So again, you're likely to just be more accurate in that situation. Additionally, we would just claim that research is more progressive, particularly more progressive than the medical sphere generally. Research and academia are traditionally quite left-wing, have done things a lot of the time being proponents of this. The reason we know that underprescription occurs is because of research that tells us that underprescription occurs, that this kind of bias does exist. This is research that is done in status quo and is likely to continue to be done because research has incentives to do this, because they want to research novelty rather than doctors who have an incentive to, just do their daily job, which is prescribing more drugs. They're likely to tune out and not take it as seriously. Finally, obviously there are things like accountability, peer review, and the ability to change this over time. Research is public in a way that a doctor's prescription is not. You can't you can't read other what doctors are prescribing other people and kind of rate it or compare it or anything like that. It's something you get individually and that is more subjective and that is told to you as to be an individual case-by-case basis. Whereas when doctors and like the academic community generally can peer review media, it has the ability to change over time. They say you get worse research because people do not trust it. I think I've just explained why people are much more likely to trust academia than they are doctors who they feel much more disconnected to. I think that we get significantly better research because there is an incentive, right, when you're basing like pain medication around it to do the research so that it is good. So you get more research on these kind of things. It means you just do get more research on things like endometriosis that are historically incredibly under-researched because like people don't put funding towards it because you need that to be able to base pain medication on it. Then they bring us a point about chronic health. I guess this at its best was like doctors won't diagnose. I think doctors have a like incentive to diagnose on either side of the house. A lot of the time people agree with what like the symptoms are. To the extent that they're not diagnosing, you probably are more likely to go find another doctor. Compare that to when you get a prescription. It's very hard, like when you have the prescription ready to go to the chemist, to go to another doctor and get a similar prescription. You're not likely to want to spend that money. Whereas if you are in chronic pain and a doctor says no, you are more likely to go seek out another source than like comparatively. But additionally, I think we just explained why this is so much better for people with chronic health conditions. And that is threefold, because the impact is massive. That's because these people have to undergo lots of pain when they're underdiagnosed. Things get worse with time, they compound, these become life-threatening conditions when they could have been resolved earlier. Secondly, it is the psychological pain we tell you at first, the fact that you feel like you are failing your community and your job. And finally, it is that you disengage with the healthcare system. They wanted to claim this. Obviously, you disengage far more when your gripe is with the healthcare system. Even if you don't like what this academia is saying, you don't then disengage with healthcare because you view it as a problem in academia. You're more likely to engage with it in that situation. Particularly when there are things like cost that mean people are likely to opt out if they've one particularly bad experience because they don't view it as worth the $90 it costs to go to the GP. This means it's really important that we have that like quality in the first place. Then they tell us pain is subjective. I would just challenge this. Obviously we can't debate about what happens in like people's bodies all the time, but actually a lot of pain and a lot of experience is somewhat similar. Again, research shows this. I can't like justify it, but people have similar reactions to things like drugs and things like conditions. And I think again, the fact that research takes a big group means we probably get like an average of this. Secondly, I think that it assumes that doctors are likely to consider this subjectivity. I've explained doctors are unlikely to, so this is again uncomparative, as in they don't deal with the subjectivity either. They're likely to make it even less subjective because they devalue certain opinions over others. But finally, we tell you can change it over time in cases where it is egregious. This means you just, don't force people with chronic pain not to like have any sort of pain at all. So happy to propose.
Thank you, Gypsy, for that speech. And to continue the case for Queensland 1, Cormac.
When my sister reported to her doctor with massive amounts of stomach pain, I'm glad that she was listened to, her pain was taken into account, and she was given pain medication, because it took years for her to be diagnosed with endometriosis. And that is the world of this affirmative team. When people go undiagnosed and their subjective experience of pain is not taken into account, they do not receive the medication that they need to live their lives and to continue to function in society. People with chronic pain disorders on their side of the house go massively underdiagnosed, and when they present to the doctors say, the literature says, we do not understand why you are in pain. We do not understand how much pain you are in, and therefore we cannot diagnose you more than this level of pain medication. Those are the people harmed on this affirmative team's world. The other thing I need to note in this introduction is we still have guidelines for the prescription of medication under our world. It is not like all this academia gets produced and then just vanishes into thin air. Doctors still look at this stuff. The thing is that what you base your final decision off is the factor in this debate. Whether you base your final decision only off that academia, or whether you take more into account what patients' subjective needs are and how they are reporting that pain. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, characterization. Secondly, why pain is subjective and why that's important. Lastly, on chronic pain. Let's do characterization first. The first question is, what do they have fiat to do? Because this debate is assuming feasibility, right? So it does not mean that they can say this research will be good. It does not mean that they can say doctors will always diagnose people correctly. It only assumes the feasibility that you can in some way prescribe people pain accurately based on what you are told by the literature, which is like what Gypsy alludes to in her speech when you talk about it is unfeasible to note all of the different conditions and how they interact and generate the accurate prescription. That is exactly what the feasibility of this debate suggests. The next thing they say is, well, we're just going to like give them a starting dose based on literature, and then we're going to move and like take into account what they say. This is very obviously a squirrel, because at the point at which you base your starting dose off this, and then patients come back and say, I am in pain, I need more medication, you are then basing your next decision on how they are subjectively reporting that pain, which means you're not adhering to their side of the debate. We also say guidelines exist on our side, obviously, to base the starting dose off that, and then alter that. We can maybe say on their side that they can, like, people can come back with side effects and you can change the dose based on that. That's pretty fair on their side, but it does not affect the people who are still in pain and still experiencing that pain. And even if you believe that this is not a squirrel, and this is totally fair for them to do in the round, that massively concedes the round, because it concedes that they should take into account patients' subjective experiences and how they are experiencing that pain, and whether this medication is accurately managing that pain for them, rather than just what the academia says, which, as conceded by second affirmative, is just an average. So, next thing they say, doctors interpret self-reports badly. The first thing I want to note here is all of their examples that they give are about people who are currently undiagnosed, for which it is worse under their side, because you do not take into account the patient's subjective needs and what they say that pain is. You just say, I do not know what to diagnose you with, so I can't give you any medication because we do not know how you are experiencing this pain and what academia I should base my prescription on. But a few responses taking them at their very best. The first is, if they have fiat to suggest that doctors will prescribe based on the academia, because of the wording of the motion, the clause assuming feasibility comes before both of the other clauses, which means that we also have counter fiat and counter feasibility to say that doctors will prescribe medication based on patients' subjective experiences. But even if you do not believe any of that, patients can still go to other doctors if they are not catered for by their current doctor and find another doctor that is less likely to be racist, more likely to be sensitive to their issues. The comparative does not work for their side because all of the doctors are basing their diagnosis based on the medical literature, so none of them are willing you to give the pain medication that is accurate to your experience because they all have the same aggregate, they all have access to the same literature. Comparatively under our side, the doctors that are racist, the doctors that are sexist are a few. There are other doctors that exist. And this is important to note because their point about minorities is like a wash, because minorities can go to minority doctors. In fact, most minority communities go to a GP that speaks their language, is from their culture, and exist in communities where they have doctors that have access to those things because they feel more comfortable there, which mitigates a lot of the harms that they don't want to talk about. But the last thing to note on this self-report badly stuff is be comparative, guys. Like, doctors see, when a patient presents to them, someone who is feeling extreme pain, but they cannot see the diagnosis that this person might have. They cannot see the mechanism by which they are experiencing that chronic pain, which means they're more likely to be empathetic on our side and diagnose them with the, and prescribe them that pain medication because they can actually see them. Compare that onto on their side. That, like, going and sending them off to a specialist to get a whole lot of diagnoses or sending them off to an x-ray is a higher threshold than prescribing them that medication. So if doctors are racist or sexist, they're less likely to do those things on your side than prescribing that medication on our side. But also, the academia you rely on, which I'm about to get to now, is far, far worse. What do they say on research? They say it's better because it is quantitative, but that is dependent on the data set being accurate. We gave you reasons why these data sets are largely inaccurate, because they historically have relied on things like mostly men reporting these studies, mostly these studies being done by men, which means that they do not take into account accurate data sets. Secondly, even if you have accurate data sets, it is about the interpretation of this data, which is also done by the white men who run these academic studies in the first place. Thirdly, they're based on historical studies as well, because research is progressive in that sense, like it's based on past research, which means it's also based on all the historically bad research. And lastly, comparatively, all of the reasons they give about you are more likely to be interrogated by your doctor don't make sense, because you're also more likely to be interrogated in an academic study about how you feel that pain, because they want their results to be the most accurate. The last thing they say is research is more progressive, but that is just asserted. We say endometriosis research is something that has lagged behind the rest of medical research for a long time, which shows that research is not very progressive in that sense. Let's then talk about opioids. Firstly, there are massive methods to mitigate opioid crises. We have things like national data sets of who is buying opioid medication from who, so people cannot doctor shop. And secondly, opioid addictions come from real injuries, which means on their side, people with real injuries still present and still get diagnosed opioids. But what it means is you're less taking into account their subjective consideration, which means you're more likely to, for example, underdiagnose them with the amount of opioids that they need, in which case they crave more and are more likely to get addicted, or overdiagnose them, in which case they are more likely to get addicted as well because they are getting more of that dose and therefore more likely to get addicted. We say it's more likely on our side to be better when you cater to them, but also weigh this argument like against the people who are affected by chronic pain. They have a choice to opt into opioids. People who are affected by chronic pain do not have a choice. They are afflicted by this condition. Secondly, getting high is something that is not necessarily a huge harm to the people that are on opioids. Eternally experiencing pain is a massive, massive harm. They are a more vulnerable group. Lastly, let's talk about pain being more subjective. They assert that different people experience pain similarly. Just asserted. We told you pain is experienced by signals in your brain. The brain is incredibly complex. Psychology is an incredibly nascent field. We do not really understand it. We cannot understand, we don't even understand how Panadol works. That's how bad we are at understanding pain. And things like the placebo effect make this apparent because different people experience placebo effects differently. Then they say, well, it's just about the average. But that is the problem because when you take the average, you're not catering to individual people's needs. On their side, you're more likely to underprescribe, more likely to overprescribe, which is incredibly harmful. Lastly, in terms of chronic pain, these people lose their faith in the medical system because even if they are slightly more accurately diagnosed, which they are not, even if that is true, they do not feel like they're being catered to. They do not feel like they're being listened to, which means they're less likely to see their doctor and get diagnosed in the first place. They're less likely to want to participate in the crucial research that this team relies upon, which amplifies all of the harms on their case. You're less likely to want to do that when you are in more pain and have to stay at home, and when you feel like this system does not cater to you. Their side hurts the most vulnerable people. Queensland takes this round.
I thank the second negative speaker for that speech. To finish off the government bench case, Jordyn.
The majority of a population is a woman or is a person of color in most Western countries and in most of the world. And that majority, the most important majority in this debate, has a fucking awful experience with doctors. Has the experience of going to a doctor and reporting something like pain and being told that they're probably exaggerating it, or not told that they're exaggerating it, told that they should go home and take a Panadol. For the majority of the population who does need to do things like take birth control, when you go and talk to your doctor about getting an IUD, which is a device that is inserted into the cervix, doctors will tell you you should take a Panadol before that procedure. The cervix is an extraordinarily sensitive organ in the body, and many women report the fact that when they get that IUD inserted, it is agonizingly painful. It can cause prolonged cramping. It can debilitate you for a day or two, and you cannot move. But doctors consistently tell you to take a Panadol, even though the academic literature and the reported experience that is fed into that literature, it's clear that this is a painful thing, that people should be given general anesthetics in many instances in order to do it. Because the problem for this team is that where we say feasibility allows us to do things like suggest that the research exists, suggest that we can create our guidelines, suggest that we can enforce this team goes far further with it. They suggest that feasibility allows them to ensure that doctors accurately assess perception and objectively feed that into their diagnoses. They think that feasibility on their side can be used to just fucking cure every doctor of racism and misogyny. That is a comical claim. They needed to deal with the fact that for the overwhelming majority of doctors who were educated 20 or 30 years ago in a medical school that was far less progressive than it is today, that were informed by far more regressive attitudes of their peers and of their teachers at that time, for those doctors, this was baked in. For those doctors, they chronically mistreated every female patient that they had, not just a few. Chronically mistreated every person of color that walked into their door and reported pain, not just a few. This was not a niche problem. It was a problem experienced by the overwhelming majority of people in the world, and even in the West, and even in white countries, when they went through the medical system. It was not enough for them to try to brush it away. Let's talk firstly about accuracy of information and whether doctors are better than academics. Then we'll talk about diagnoses and unknown conditions. We'll talk about subjectivity, and finally about opioids. The first thing to say on accuracy of information is that their claims are just kind of comical here when they suggest that academics are much less able to understand these things and report on them than GPs are. One, the reason that we know this is a problem is empirically because of the academic studies that have pointed out chronic underdiagnosis in women, that have pointed out the ways in which doctors mistreat people of color. That is just like a fact. It is why we are having this debate. So for them to suggest that the academics are just as problematic or just as ignorant is just a denial of reality. The second thing to say, though, is that obviously on our side, this creates a massive incentive for governments to improve this science over time, to fund it more, because it underpins the entire health system and it underpins how people engage with it. The third thing to say, though, is that the status quo is just a good thing. This is a field of continual development. Compare that to a GP who went to school 20 years ago and is not under obligations to continue to read academic papers. An academic is consistently reading the papers and building upon them. They always have the most up-to-date information, and they're in a far more progressive left-wing environment. Like, walk around a university and talk to academics. They're all pretty progressive people, and they all believe and understand critical theory, which is crazy to think about, but is actually just true. Which means that for these academics, their reports, their studies are far more accurate when it comes to actually figuring out whether conditions do cause pain, what that pain in fact looks like. See the fact that often anesthesiologists are actually quite good at treating pain. People rarely report things like waking up mid-procedure. That is because for anesthesiologists, they do engage far more deeply with the academia and continue to do so because their field is one that requires more specialization and training, whereas GPs consistently fail at this because they do not continually engage with it, which is why you should believe what academics are telling you to do when it comes to setting these base doses, when it comes to saying whether these conditions do cause pain. That is a far more accurate source of information, and does mean that on our side, people on net get far more access to these treatments when they have a diagnosis. The second thing to say, though, is that we give people more diagnoses, because often the problem is that it is hard but not impossible to get a diagnosis. And the reason that people are deterred is because of what we tell you about how their experience with the medical system on their side is so much worse, because doctors filter what they're subjectively reporting through their own biases and mistreat them, which means that people often think, well, there's no point in even looking for a diagnosis for my condition. I think I have endometriosis, but why would I even bother to pay for the screening? My doctor's gonna tell me to take fucking Panadol. Who cares? When you know that you are guaranteed to get treatment for your diagnosis, you are guaranteed to actually have a solution to pain that has been plaguing you, that does make patients go the extra mile, put in the effort, spend the money, when they otherwise often just feel like it is completely hopeless. We give people that hope and that motivation, which is often actually the block. For somebody in a rural community, this makes it worthwhile to drive for hundreds of kilometers to a city and go attend a screening. On their side, you think there's no point to it because your rural doctor who was educated 50 years ago is never going to give you the treatment, except for on our side where they are bound to do so, which is why this is far more important, why this is far more useful. Leaving this up to a doctor's perception, which is always filtered through their biases, always filtered through a bunch of ancient stuff that they were taught before about how black people experience less pain, which we know is not true because of the reports that academics do, is what causes these problems to be intractable, why they are intractable under the status quo, which this team defends. The last thing to do then is to weigh off all of the people who do have diagnoses or could have diagnoses on our side against the small number of people with unknown conditions on theirs. The first thing to say is that they do have a condition for unknown conditions, which sounds kind of counterintuitive, but they do just say you have a chronic pain disorder. Like, that is something that is understood, and there's a delineation within that as well. Chronic back pain is considered different to chronic stomach pain. These are conditions that, while they are poorly understood, are identified as being real. You can be diagnosed with, and you would be able to access painkillers on our side, which means that obviously, again, maybe our academics are less accurate here because the conditions are very broad, but at the point where you are able to access a diagnosis of chronic stomach pain, you are again guaranteed treatment on our side. And again, maybe it is harder to know exactly where to start that dose, but obviously we were not bound to do things like leave people like zombies because we overprescribed them initially, or leave people unable to function. Of course, you could continue to consult with your doctor. They want to continue to consult with their doctor as well. It is absolutely insane to suggest that it is a squirrel, to just have the medical system function a deeply reasonable way. Similarly, they're not bound to just stick with what the initial report was and never change it. Like, I think we can probably also work with patients here. The last thing then to talk about is just, what about when subjective experience does not align with our academic papers? Given the material I've given you on why this information is actually quite good, and academics are pretty good about this, I would suggest that this is a tiny minority of people, and they really just use buzzwords and claims about brains being complex here to suggest that maybe this is subjective, but it probably isn't, or at least isn't in a meaningful way. Ask yourself, when you stub your toe, where would you rate that on a scale of 1 to 10? I think most people would probably say it's about a 2. And my 2 might be different from your 2, but having the information that for most people that is about a 2 is enough to actually understand, okay, well, similarly, people's subjective experience of what exactly painkillers do for them is also different, but we know that these things seem to kind of align. And for most people, you treat a 2 with Panadol, and that works really well, or you treat a 7 with fentanyl, and that works really well, and you would do that at a particular dose. Which means that while my 2 is different to your 2, my fentanyl trip is different to your fentanyl trip, we can still match these things up in a way that means that they broadly align. The second thing to say here, though, is that obviously, again, if a patient consistently comes back and says the dose isn't working for me, I think it is quite reasonable to suggest that we could adjust that, just like they can adjust that as well. But this is about the initial treatment plan and the initial dose. And often doctors are kind of reluctant to change that. I'm willing to accept that as well. The difference here is that on our side, that initial treatment is far more accurate. That reluctance to change is symmetric. When theirs is less accurate, it locks you into a far worse treatment plan. What do they give you in response to this? The last thing they give you at the dying moments of 2N is the frankly insulting claim that if you're being treated by a doctor who's racist or misogynist, you could just go see a woman or person of color, as though those people aren't also affected by biases and as though they are universally applicable. This is nowhere near enough to stand up to the far more accurate scripts that we get for the, again, numerical majority of the population in the rest of the world. For that reason, we clearly take it.
Thanks, Jordyn. And now to finish off this excellent debate, Noah.
They can claim that they might get better scripts under their side of the house, but better scripts only matter if you get those people diagnosed in the first place. And the problem with diagnosis and diagnosing someone is you can never prove someone has something a lot of these times. If it's a chronic illness, because we don't know what causes it, if it's something like chronic pain. And yes, we do understand that there are different types, but the way we judge those is based on symptoms. That's how you make a diagnosis. And if you're judging someone based on symptoms, then all of their bias, all their arguments about bias stand. So presumably then, under their side, doctors are equally biased when they are making diagnoses. Why is our side better then for getting diagnoses? Our side is better because the comparative in this debate is deciding where doctors turn for more authority, whether it is patients' judgments or whether it is like academia. And when you turn to patients' judgments more, you have to confront that bias and you have to listen to them. Instead, academia gives you a way out to opt into that bias, to not listen to what your patient is saying and say, hey, look, we really don't know what causes this. Opioids are a big deal. We really don't want to give you them unless you can really prove that you have this, so we're not going to prescribe you at all. What does that mean for this debate? What this means is that all of their benefits about better scripts are very marginal, because the problem with that is someone is in slightly more or slightly less pain because because of their argument about the bell curve, right? Comparatively, we have people under our side of the house who do not get pain medication at all. They do not get pain medication and they live their whole fucking lives in pain. Their symptoms get much, much worse. They never get treated at all. Our side is better for diagnosis. We win this debate. Okay, firstly, let's talk about research and accuracy. We'll talk about bias in doctors and academia and think about what's more accurate. Okay, let's deal with their claims about why doctors are more biased. I think that by and large, what we've proven to you here is that comparatively academia moves slower than doctors do, and that is because doctors turn over, whereas academia needs to cite past studies and stuff like that. They never prove that they're going to get a massive, massive amount of funding under their side that is going to allow you to reevaluate all the historically bad studies that have been done. There is another problem here which they do not deal with, which is that you do not know which studies are bad, right? Like if there were racist people in academia previously, you don't know who they were, and you don't know how that impacted all of the academia about pain medication and stuff to follow. What I think that means is that as we move forward into a more equitable society, that doctors are likely to be better than academics there. Secondly, obviously doctors are trained to check their biases. That is why med schools have medical ethics classes, right? So I think that mitigates very greatly the kind of biases that they're likely to have. Comparatively, academics absolutely do not have that. I think for all the reasons that academia is hard to access in a lot of places, especially good academia that would allow you to get published in journals in pharmacology and stuff like that. I think the demographics of those people are likely to stay the same. I also don't think pharmacologists do things like research critical race theory. Seems like a very different area to me. So I think those people people are likely to stay biased, for the reason Cormac tells you then, they're likely to interpret their bias, or interpret the data in a different way, or in a biased way, and observe that at the point at which they think that people interpreting patients' claims about pain is where the problem is, that happens under both sides of the house. Because the way you do one of these studies, right, is you have a group of participants, and then they make claims about pain, and then you have to interpret it. And then at that point, if academics have not been bias trained and stuff like that, they are much more likely to interpret those badly for historical reasons, but even now. What does that prove to you? I think it proves to you that studies are much more biased under their side of the house. I think the last thing to prove here is that why studies are very unlikely to get better. And I think this is especially, the reason why this is because you need a lot of funding to do studies, to do research into these kind of things. And we give you a lot of reasons why you're unlikely to do that for a bunch of diseases that are not very common, because not many people are advocating for them, because there is a lot of shame and stigma around chronic disease, for all the reasons they give about these people not willing to come forward, not believing their symptoms are real and stuff like that, because maybe people have told them that that's not true. I think all of that distrust means that studies don't become better under their side, because they do not believe that what they're that what they're arguing for is something that is or is something that's ever going to be resolved, and they distrust their own symptoms. Under our side, though, we have doctors that listen to you more. We entirely miss that, the problem of academia, and instead your doctor is forced to listen to you more, because the comparative in this debate is whether your doctor, when they're reading the guidelines and deciding where to put you or thinking about diagnoses, decides to think more about your your decision about your pain. Maybe that means that he levels it down a little bit, but the thing is, you still get diagnosed, you still start somewhere, and if it keeps getting worse, you're likely to get better outcomes. Okay, next thing in this then, how does prescriptions work and this kind of thing, and what's the interactions between patients and doctors and this and that. Okay, so let's talk briefly about guidelines. Obviously, we still have guidelines under our side of the house. That's because the Royal Medical College gives doctors guidelines, and obviously that they have an incentive to do that for the reasons they give about the opioid crisis and stuff like that. At the point at which they come back and reevaluate under their side of the house, presumably that means that doctors are quite responsible with diagnosing under our side of the house. They use the guidelines in a way that is responsible. But what it means is that from the beginning of the diagnostic process and the treatment process, the doctors are much more willing to tailor those guidelines to, instead of going with simply the average rate, to go, this person's complaining a lot, I will up their dose more, or I will take their dose down a little bit because they don't seem to be in as much pain, or whatever they say. That means that from the beginning we get a more accurate, treatment plan. I think the other important thing here then is that really lowers all of their impacts about opioids. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Okay, next thing to prove then, and if we're going to get better outcomes for patients, is to prove under our side why these people do go to doctors in the first place. We do give you many, many reasons why these people go to doctors. I think if you are in a lot of chronic pain, you probably just keep seeking out treatment. If you do feel like something really is wrong, you are likely to go and try and solve it, because it has a massive impact over your life. I think the next thing to say there is that when they tell you something about these people don't feel listened to by doctors and stuff like that, I think what that means is that under our side of the house, A, it's less likely to happen in the first place, but B, I think you just go to more doctors, right? The final thing to say there is on diagnosis. And they tell you here that diagnosis is going to be deterred by this bias and those kind of things. Oh no, actually, I've already spoken about that, sorry. Okay, last thing to say about the effects on patients and stuff like that. This is the material about subjectivity. What they don't seem to understand about this subjectivity material is that every patient is different. And this is the final advantage of doctors under our side of the house, compared to academia, is that doctors treat every patient as their own case, compared to academia, which generalizes all different cases. That's incredibly important for the reasons we give you about different people have different pain tolerances. It's not good enough under their side of the house to say, it seems to level out between your two and my two, because if their argument is about getting marginal differences in pain prescriptions, then the leveling out effect that they want is entirely is counterintuitive to that argument. But secondly, many patients are likely to have things like comorbidities and stuff like that, especially for the kind of people we're talking about who have undiagnosed diseases for a long time, which get worse. And I think the impact of that is that there are very few studies about interactions with comorbidities, which means you drastically harm the treatment that they get. At the end of this debate, when we talk about patients, what should you weigh up? Under our side, we tell you many more people get diagnosed. Perhaps their treatment is slightly worse, although I do not even believe that. I think it is actually more accurate. Under their side, their only benefit is more accurate prescriptions. What that means is that if you do not believe any of our reasoning about why people go to doctors, about why those doctors treat them well, and all of those kind of things, we win on the fact that they get at least some treatment at all. And but I think that itself We also win on the accuracy because doctors use guidelines and then tailor their decisions to what patients tell them. We win.
Thanks everyone for an excellent